computer to respond. Nuts, man. The radio was just talking before about how the Cubs came into this game so hot and then they haven't scored crap worth of runs. Like they only got 3 runs last game and they were all in the same inning, and here they are.
Wow.
Nothing.
Gotta love sports.
Oh yeah. Okay, so we're live. Welcome to anybody who's watching on YouTube. This is the recording of the Fantasy Authority Podcast, episode number 68. We're welcoming Ben. How do you say your last name, Ben?
Cummins.
Cummins. Okay, that's what I thought. I didn't want to mess it up, though. So there we go. Ben Cummins. Welcome, Ben Cummins, to the show. We'll do a more formal welcome, Ben, when we go ahead and start the actual podcast here. I'd like to just do this little intro for YouTube. I like to do a little intro for YouTube because sometimes I leave the volume on, and it's a good way to just catch any errors or anything like that.
Nice. I like it.
All right. So we're going to start the live podcast in 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fantasy Authority Podcast, episode number 68. Hope you all had an enjoyable Halloween over the weekend. Well, a little past the weekend. It was just this past Monday. I had trick-or-treaters for the first time. I was super pumped. Really excited to get the trick-or-treaters. Lots of cool costumes out there. Had a great time. If you're new to the show, I, of course, am your host, Anthony Pinzone. Alongside me today, I have Jennifer Smith, Kevin Steele, and a contributor for pretty much everybody under the sun, 2QBs.com, FF Ballers, RotoViz, Roto Underworld, and apparently a diehard Broncos fan, which should be very interesting because, as you know, Kevin Steele is a diehard Chiefs fan. So let's hope we get some back and forth here today. Welcome Ben Cummins to the show. Hey, Ben.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. I think my first article for fantasy football was published in March, and it's been crazy ever since, and it has been awesome getting invited to come on different podcasts, and this is no different, and so I appreciate it. And I think Ryan Williams writes for you guys, and that's my boy, so obviously you guys know what you're doing, and I'm excited to talk some fantasy football tonight.
Absolutely, man. We're excited to have you on. Good shout out there for Ryan Williams. I'm sure he'll appreciate that. He might even be here in the chat with us tonight, knowing that you're on. So, Ryan,
nice.
If you're here, shoot us a little message there on the YouTube chat. Good to have you, man. I'm really, really hoping that you and Kev get into something about this Broncos and Chiefs game.
We'll see what happens.
For that. Looking at your Twitter profile, I see diehard Broncos fans, and my eyes just lit up. I'm like, oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, you got to instigate it, right?
Exactly. I'll do my best. So on tonight's show, guys, of course, we'll be talking about the biggest stories heading into Week 9. Another retirement announcement we'll get into in just a second. We'll be giving you some streaming options as well. We're going to get into the best of the rest, and then we are going to give you our mid-season fantasy report, biggest surprises, biggest busts, and most likely to bounce back from a slow start. We also have a little fantasy MVP talk as well. A lot to get to, guys, so let's jump right into it. Andre Johnson retires from the NFL. Haven't heard his name in quite some time. Actually, his last catch, I believe, was against my Miami Dolphins. Could be a Hall of Famer, I think. I think he definitely has the stats there to get into the Hall of Fame. I guess we'll see. The wide receiver position is very crowded when it comes to the Hall of Fame. How about that Niall Davis trade for the Packers? Trade it to the Packers. Packers cut him today. The Jets signed him today. The Jets released him today and signed C.J. Spiller instead. That's a whirlwind right there, ladies and gentlemen. Niall Davis has been on one heck of a ride. So today, maybe yesterday, he was dropped. I don't know. I don't know the exact details of the day he was cut, but I can tell you within 24 hours, he was cut, signed, and cut again. So that's kind of crazy. Really kind of big news here because he was a high draft pick for a lot of people. Jamal Charles to the IR. I know Kev wants to talk a ton about it, but we're going to talk about that a little later in our midseason report. Hint, hint, he may show up in the bust column. Just an idea there. Jamie Collins, the linebacker for the New England Patriots, gets traded to the Browns for a conditional third-round pick, and on Halloween Day, he goes from 7-1 to 0-8. Big Ben also expected to return this weekend versus the Ravens. Big news for Big Ben owners. More news, guys, but I kind of want to get a little more in-depth on these because they're probably the most fantasy-relevant news of the week. Percy Harvin comes out of retirement and re-signs with the Buffalo Bills. I personally don't think he has much value, but what do you guys think?
I'm not that interested in it. I think the minimal impact is can be found on Robert Woods. I think Robert Woods was a guy that you could, if you were in desperation, you could play him as a floor play with Sammy Watkins out for most of the year. I'm not sure when or if Sammy Watkins is supposed to come back, but I think Woods missed a game a few weeks ago. But other than that, if he was in there, he was kind of the wide receiver one. And again, if you needed a floor play, he could be it. But with Harvin coming in, it remains to be seen what his role is going to be. But if he's healthy, which has been a problem for him, he could take some targets away from Woods in an offense where there's not that much passing volume to go around anyway. So I think that's the minimal impact. Is it kind of takes Robert Woods out of that floor play consideration.
I think the interesting part of the whole move is obviously he knows the offense, so it's not like he's going to have to spend any time. I think on a week – I think he's just a dart throw at this point. Obviously, he's not like he's been in training camp or done anything. He's pretty much coming right off the street. But they don't really have anybody else, like you mentioned, with just Robert Woods, Marquise Goodwin's injured. Sammy Watkins, which I did write up in my waiver rankings this week, is expected – well, I shouldn't say is expected. Looks like he could return, but it's not until week 12. That's the first time he's able to return. He did shed the walking boot this week, so he's a guy that I advocate for everybody to pick up because he's still widely available. So many people dropped him. But Percy Harvin, I've never really been a huge fan anyway, and certainly not a guy that I would start. But if you're in a deeper format and with so many buys this week, he could be worth a dart throw, but not something I'm rushing out to get.
Yeah, we're going to get into a little bit later, too. I think there may be some better options out there. We'll get to that in the best of the rest. How about Jacquizz Rodgers has his foot in a boot? So now Doug Martin, Charles Sims, Jacquizz Rodgers. Buccaneers having no luck with the running backs. They re-signed Mike James. I actually like Mike James. I thought he was a pretty decent running back. I think he could be a decent pickup in deeper leagues. What do you guys think?
Yeah, you want to talk about dart throws. We saw Jacquizz Rodgers get picked up and thrust right in there by Dirk Cutter, who had some history with Rodgers. Well, could potentially be the same thing with Antoine Smith, who recently signed with the Bucs and also has history with Dirk Cutter. He played more snaps than Peyton Barber. He played more snaps than Peyton Barber last week, and Antoine Smith is a guy that has shown in the past that he can break off a big run. So if you want to talk about a dart throw with all these bye weeks, if you need somebody desperately, you can throw in Antoine Smith and hope for that big play. And I think this presents an interesting opportunity to buy Doug Martin. I'm not sure how bad the injury is to Jacquizz Rodgers, and I also don't really know the extent and prognosis of Doug Martin, but it is something to consider and a guy that I'm interested in looking at, because if he gets healthy in a couple weeks, we've seen the success of these Buccaneers running backs, and Martin could be that guy going forward.
100% agree. And I mean, if you've seen their schedule down the stretch, and especially for the playoffs, it's absolutely just juicy. And so I really like Doug Martin. But as for this week, Antoine Smith, you're right. Last week he came in and he outsnapped Peyton Barber 22-3, which I thought was a little surprising. I thought Peyton Barber would be the guy who would get the first crack, who obviously he's been there. So, I mean, Smith, they had just signed 13 days ago. So, I don't know. I thought it was a bit surprising. But, again, like you mentioned, so many guys on bye. It's kind of the theme of the week. Another guy that, at the very least, a flex play. I personally wouldn't spend too much on him, especially if you're in like a fab. I wouldn't throw out a bunch of money to get him because I don't think he's going to be a long-term option, nor would I spend a high waiver on him. So for me, he's just kind of a guy if you're in a pinch.
Yeah, Antoine Smith could actually be a pretty decent play this week against the Falcons, though. It's a name to look out for. A lot of buys this week. A lot. I may look at him myself. Exciting news for the Browns. I know that doesn't happen very often, but they did get Jamie Collins for a conditional third, so that's good news. Other good news is Corey Coleman is cleared for full practice. He is set to return in Week 9. Josh McCown returned last week and looked mighty good. They just could not finish that game against the Jets. They dominated the first half and completely fell apart the second half, which has been the story for them all season long. What impact does Corey Coleman have on this offense? Could they finally get a win? And if that's not on the table, what do you think about his fantasy value going forward?
Yeah, this is really interesting. Corey Coleman is electric. He was a stud in college, and he looked great before he got injured. I think it was week 2 or 3. Had a couple touchdown catches, I think it was. So it's definitely going to have an impact. I think, we're going to see some targets taken away from Terrelle Pryor and possibly Gary Barnidge as well. And so, Terrelle Pryor has been a stud this year, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So there could be a little bit of a negative impact there with Corey Coleman coming back and taking some targets. But I think the really interesting thing is who's going to be the quarterback in Cleveland, because I like Josh McCown a lot. And Cody Kessler has impressed me. But I would, if I'm playing one of these Browns receivers, I want Josh McCown as the quarterback. He's shown that, he has the YOLO ball. He'll throw it deep. I think Terrelle Pryor had a crazy yards per target this past week, and Corey Coleman clearly benefited from that. I think it was week 3 before Josh McCown got hurt when he had that good game before Corey Coleman got hurt himself. So it'll be interesting to see who the quarterback is, but Coleman is definitely somebody worth picking up if for some reason he's still out there, and he's worth playing. I don't know if I would trust him this first week back, but with all these buys, it's interesting. But at the very least, a guy that I would want on my roster if I can make it work, because he does have that high upside.
I agree with that. He's owned in 43% of Yahoo leagues, so he's definitely still out there. And whether or not this week, I think I kind of agree. We'd want to see maybe how he acclimates back into the offense and things against Dallas. But he gets Baltimore in week 10, and in week 2, he had 104 yards and 2 touchdowns. So Corey Coleman, for me, on the Browns, is somebody that you definitely want to roster and pick up if you haven't already. And if he's out there in more than 50% of leagues, then I'm surprised at that a little bit. But that just means you can steal him this week on the waiver wire and kind of sneak under the radar there.
Yeah, I'm surprised at that too. And he broke his hand, right? Wasn't that what it was?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like he's coming back from a knee injury or a leg injury, which I think helps him a lot too, because it shouldn't take him too much to get acclimated back into the offense, other than he's a rookie and he's missed some time. Yeah,
that is definitely the most positive thing. I mean, it's not something you're worried about re-injury either. I mean, with him, or something that's going to limit his game or anything like that. And then, I mean, it's even more surprising actually in ESPN. He's only owned in 31% of leagues. So
wow,
certainly widely available to be picked up. I mean, I've been telling people to pick him up for weeks because I think he is a game-changing talent. But that's another conversation for another day. But he's certainly somebody who should be rostered, especially as with the landscape that is the terrible wide receiver position this year.
Yeah, man, I am actually starting him this week. I got the bye week blues this week. So, Corey Coleman, you're getting thrown right into that fire, buddy. You better get it done.
There you go.
He back in week 2, Ben, he lit it up. 5 of 8, 104 yards and 2 touchdowns.
Okay, week 2. Yeah, thank you.
Not sure if that was RG3 or Josh McCown. Either way, it was a huge game for him. So hopefully he gets back to form, because I could really use him.
I'm almost positive it was McCown.
Yeah. All right, Corey Coleman. How about those Eagles, guys? Blowing that game late Sunday night against the Dallas Cowboys for pretty much the division lead. Let Dak Prescott go up the field to tie the game and up the field in overtime. But more importantly, Ryan Mathews played only 10% of the snaps to Darren Sproles, who played over 80%. Clearly, Darren Sproles seems to be the back to have in Philadelphia right now. But, man, this guy, he can't seriously carry the load, right? So is this a Wendell Smallwood, Darren Sproles backfield now, and is Ryan Mathews cuttable? I've been telling people to cut him, so to answer my own question.
So I don't really know what to do with this backfield. I was pretty high on Ryan Mathews coming into the year, especially at his ADP. I think he's a really talented player, but yeah, his usage has been all over lately, which doesn't give you much confidence at all to start him. I think the thing that I'll say, though, is that I think that Ryan Mathews still has the goal line back pretty much locked up. He has 5 touchdowns on the year to Sproles 1. So if you're in a standard league and, you're looking for a touchdown, I think he's still a guy that you can still throw out there. I mean, even in only playing 10% of the snaps, I think you said, he still had a touchdown the other night. And I don't see Sproles playing 80% of the snaps consistently moving forward he's just not that type of player. But I definitely think this is a positive for people that have Sproles or picked up Sproles, because in PPR leagues especially, he's a flex. He's a guy that you can throw out there and, hope he has a big play, kind of like we talked about with Antoine Smith. But his usage should be a little bit more consistent. So, they're both interesting still, but overall this running back situation is a mess. And I mean, that's about the most positive spin I can put on it. I mean, I have Ryan Mathews in a few leagues, and he's been on my bench lately. And until I see more volume, he's probably going to stay there. But again, if you need to hope for a touchdown, he's somebody that you can still play. And I understand cutting him. I don't think I'm personally there yet, but I totally understand it, especially if you need to pick up somebody better during these bye weeks.
Yeah, I think it's going to boil down to ultimately roster construction and, how many bench spots you have. Because if you don't, dropping a running back, especially like Ryan Mathews, is very, very risky, because obviously we know that there's just not a ton of options there. It's not like the wide receiver position where it's as deep. So I wouldn't advocate dropping a guy like Ryan Mathews, but Darren Sproles, on the other hand, the guy just won't go away. I mean, every year you're kind of like, okay, well, he's just going to kind of fall off, and nobody ever really buys into him to start the season. And then here we are, heading into week 9, and Darren Sproles is still a thing and out touching Ryan Mathews. I mean, this past week he out touched him 20-4. I think Sproles is much more of a PPR guy. So like you mentioned, he's not going to ever be a touchdown guy. So that really limits him in standard formats. But in PPR right now, I think you have to look at him as an RB2.
Yeah, in PPR leagues right now, he is the 32nd ranked running back, 3 games over 10 points. That does include a bye week, keep in mind, though, so numbers may be a little bit skewed. He could be a bit higher than that. How about Derek Carr? I mean, it was a nasty game versus Tampa. They should have been dominating this team. It shouldn't have been close, but it didn't matter. It went to overtime. We were this close to having yet another tie. It would have been the second of the week, the third in 2 weeks. But Carr gets it to Roberts. He breaks the tackle, runs it for the touchdown. Raiders win. They're now 6-2. Carr had 500 yards passing, scored 43 fantasy points, and single-handedly beat me in one league. Wow. Are the Raiders legit? Is Derek Carr legit? What do we think of this situation here?
Yeah, as a Broncos fan, it pains me to say this, but I do think they're legit. Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree are both just studs, especially Amari Cooper. We saw what he did this past week. Cooper's third in receiving yards and third in catches in the NFL, and Crabtree is 12th in receiving yards and 5th in catches in the NFL. And obviously, Derek Carr has a lot to do with that. Seth Roberts is a pretty darn good wide receiver 3. They have Clive Walford, who can do some things at tight end. There's a lot of weapons on this team, and I like all 3 of those guys going forward. The thing to keep in mind is Derek Carr has, especially last year, started off seasons really hot and then has fallen off. I think kind of fallen off the last 2 years. So that's something to look for, because, if it happens again, it's definitely looking like a trend. But I don't know if I would bet on that, the way they're playing, and I definitely think they're legit. And I mean, I don't know if Carr is to the point where he's an every week starter for me, but if he has a solid matchup, and I'm not sure what the matchup they play the Broncos this week. Hopefully the Broncos win. I don't know if I'd be rolling him out there against the Broncos. I'd probably look for an option with a quarterback with a better matchup, but I think Crabtree and Cooper are studs, and Carr is definitely in the consideration to start every week.
That's a gritty win, too. I know, people are going to say similar to what I just said. Hey, it was the Buccaneers. They should have won easily. But this was in Tampa. And the Raiders had played the Jags the week before. They didn't even go home after the Jacksonville game. They stayed in Florida until the Tampa game before they went home. I mean, that's a gritty win on the road in overtime. 6-2 now at the halfway point. They have to be feeling good about that. Are they legit? I don't know. I don't watch the Raiders close enough to know that, but I think that win versus Tampa on Sunday was pretty impressive.
See, I mean, it depends on which way you're talking about with them. If you're talking about from, a fantasy perspective, yeah, I mean, their schedule, the AFC West, I guess just start out by saying the AFC West is the best division in football, and I don't think it's particularly close.
Amen.
At a 5-2 or above, the Chargers are 3-5, and they've really been real close to being. I mean, they could have 2 or 3 more wins quite easily. However, with the Raiders, I don't think they're legit, and that's not a Chiefs fan trying to throw shade their way, if you will. I just don't think they've really played anybody. The one time they've played an actual legit defense, they got shut down and really didn't look great at all. But other than that, their schedule has been cake. And now I get it. You have to play the teams that are ahead of you, but we saw this same thing last year with them. Anytime they played a great defense or a poor defense, they exploited them and they looked great. But as soon as they hit the schedule where they started playing legit defenses, they fell apart. And I think that's exactly who they are this year. However, the schedule is so much easier that it's not really going to show itself too much. But this week, I don't think they have a chance against Denver. Like I said, the Denver's defense is elite. I've seen it. I've seen this play out too many times with Oakland that you start to buy in, and then they actually play a team that's actually legitimate, and then they fall flat on their face. And I think that's probably what there's no way they should have won last week. 24 penalties, and there's no way they should have won. But they were playing a Tampa team who does not have a much of a defense. And so there's no way. If they would have done that to most any other team, it wouldn't have happened. But if you look at their upcoming schedule, they got Denver, then bye, then they go to Houston, which has a very good defense. If Carolina can figure their stuff out, they still have to come to Kansas City. Then they have to play Denver at Denver again. So fantasy-wise, yeah, I think they're a pretty solid bet. But are they legit? As I think they're going to be like a threat in the playoffs, or will they even make the playoffs? I don't know yet. I think they'll make the playoffs because they're 6-2. But I think they're not somebody I'm afraid of at all.
That's a very good point. I hadn't really examined their schedule that much, so I like everything you just said. I'll put it like that.
Well, realistically, they have to win 3 or 4 more games to make it into the playoffs. They do face the Texans, Panthers, Bills, Chiefs, Chargers, and Colts, as well as the Broncos twice. The schedule is considerably harder in the second half of the year than it was in the first. I do think, though, you're right. I think they could probably pull off 3 to 4 wins in the second half.
Well, plus you have to look at the playoffs for fantasy. They get Kansas City again and then San Diego again, which they did very well against, and then in Indianapolis. So if you're a fantasy perspective, you might want to not necessarily start Carr and some of, the next few weeks. But if you're in the fantasy playoffs, he's not a bad one to have on your roster. So you got to kind of start looking forward at this point if you're going to have some people on your bench if you have those spots.
I mean, he didn't do well against Kansas City.
No.
He only threw 225 yards and 1 touchdown and a pick. He only had 11.8 fantasy points. And not to mention, Justin Houston hasn't even played yet, and he's going to be back in the next week or two. I'm surprised the Chiefs' defense has looked as well as it has the last really 3 or 4 weeks without Justin Houston. I thought it was going to be a problem, but it hasn't been at all. And now they get Justin Houston back, and Justin Houston means just as much to them as Von Miller does to the Broncos. So I don't know. I wouldn't be, especially at Kansas City on a Thursday night football game, which that game's going to be. I would not be betting on Derek Carr and the Raiders at Kansas City on Thursday night.
Unfortunately, it's the first round of the playoffs. 2 out of 3 of those, I think they have a good matchup. Kansas City, I agree, might be a tough one for them. So they do overall give up the 16th most fantasy points, but, I mean, that's skewed. And like you said, they were missing players. So it's just you got to kind of be looking forward and seeing. I mean, a lot of, even though we don't necessarily do it, a lot of teams are rostering 2 quarterbacks. So if you're looking forward in your game planning and you have another quarterback and you're kind of trying to look at who piecemeal might be the best for your playoffs and you're trying to win your league, he's not a bad set 2 out of 3. So.
Yeah, I play mostly 10-team leagues myself, and our playoffs are week 15 and week 16, and that's great matchups there against the Chargers and the Colts. Good job by you there, Jen. How about we get to some streaming options, guys? That's it for the news, by the way. If you'd like to see anything more about the news, head on over to thefantasyauthority.com and head on over to TFA Podcast. You can see the show notes there and get all the latest news from around the NFL and on this podcast. How about the Week 9 streaming options, though? We're going to take one per person. We'll start with the quarterback, and we will start with our guest, Ben. Who is a quarterback streaming option you like this week?
So first of all, I think Marcus Mariota is the quarterback 8 on the year. I think Jen's going to talk about him. If he's available, that'd be my pick. But he's owned in, I think, over 50%. Jen can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I wanted to get a little bit deeper, and this isn't going to feel good. Definitely, I think shout out to JJ and Danny with Living the Stream. I think they say just don't watch the game. But I think when you check the box score and you check your fantasy points at the end of this game, I think you're going to be happy with what Colin Kaepernick does for you. He's at home versus the Saints. I like streaming quarterbacks at home. The Saints give up the 4th most passing yards per game so far this year. And I don't think Colin Kaepernick is a really good quarterback, but that doesn't necessarily matter for fantasy. Colin Kaepernick has 150 rushing yards in 2 games, and rushing yards can be gold for quarterbacks in fantasy football. He's also thrown a touchdown in both games, so he's still getting you some points through the air as well. And we saw Blaine Gabbert have some big weeks in Chip Kelly's offense, and we know that Kaepernick is more athletic than Blaine Gabbert. So there are going to be opportunities for Kaepernick this week in Chip Kelly's offense. And if he gets you a rushing touchdown, which he hasn't gotten yet, then you could go from a pretty solid floor week to a pretty nice point total from Kaepernick this week. So that's my streamer at the quarterback position.
There it is. I'm going to go put him in on the SFB. I actually have Colin Kaepernick. I drafted him. How about that?
There you go.
Kev, how about you, man? Who you got at the quarterback position this week?
Speaking of quarterbacks who don't feel good, Ryan Tannehill. I don't know. So when you look at Ryan Tannehill, he obviously hasn't really been that great this year. That's not breaking news to anybody. He has had a few pretty solid weeks, but other than that, it's been pretty underwhelming. And then, as we know, the Dolphins have really gotten the run game going the last 2 weeks before their bye. But the problem is when you're playing the Jets have been pretty elite against the run. The rush defense only allowed 68 yards a game to running backs. However, they do allow the 6th most receptions to running backs. And then to build off that, the Jets, where you beat them is through the air. They have allowed the most passing yards in the league at 302 yards per game, and have also allowed 1.875 touchdowns per week to the opposing quarterbacks. So I don't think you were going to see a 3rd straight Jay Ajayi blow-up game. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Jets are one of the best run defenses they're going to see all season. And so for me, I actually think this is a nice way to with 6 teams on bye this week. I actually like Ryan Tannehill. Like I said, it's one of those you don't feel great saying it. But I do believe that this is one of the weeks that you can really roster him, and he could easily put up QB1 numbers.
I mean, listen, 2 years ago, this guy was he finished top 10, top 12 quarterback. He finished a QB1 just 2 years ago. I don't know why he's regressed so much. Ben, in case you didn't know, I am a Dolphins fan. It's a very frustrating topic for me.
Understandably so.
Every time Kevin puts Tannehill on this, I get irritable. I think I need like a pill or something. Does anybody have any chill pills?
Just get your hopes up one more time. Oh,
I agree. It's a good matchup. I was actually going to put him on the list, but I was like, nope, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, I like him this week too. Yeah, it's a very good matchup for him.
For all the same reasons too. Ajayi is not going to. I don't think he's going to do that well against the Jets, but I didn't think he was going to do well against the Bills either. So we'll see.
True.
All right, Jen, you're up. I know Ben stole your thunder a little bit here, but what do you like so much about Mr. Mariota?
Oh, Mariota. Well, I mean, he's been on a hot streak lately. 10 touchdowns in the past 4 games. He's got San Diego this week, which are 24th in the pass defense. They have been a little stingy lately, so I'm not saying he's going to blow them out. But when you're coming into a Week 9 bye and you've got Palmer and Cutler, Dalton, Brady, Cousins all on bye, I mean, you're looking at guys that can get you some points, and this is a guy that Week 5, number 1, QB fantasy. Week 6, number 3. Week 7, number 8. Week 8, number 11. So this is a guy that can get you the points. He's got a high ceiling, not just to see a threat through the air, but he can run for you as well. We haven't gotten a touchdown, I don't think, this year, but he had 2 60-yard-plus rushing games. And so I think as far as the ceiling can go, Mariota is somebody that you should be looking at, especially if he's on your waiver. And I did look, and he's available in
He's 76% owned on Yahoo. So this is a guy that may or may not be on your waiver. So, I like that we went a little bit deeper when we talked about some other guys. And I also think this might be a DeMarco Murray game. So keep that in mind. San Diego is really weak against the run, so they might be really involving Murray here. I mean, he's been just an amazing fantasy player. So keeping that in mind, they'll probably balance that offense. But I think he's a good play this week for sure if you're streaming.
Absolutely. Mariota has been on fire. Fantastic picks there for you guys. Other guys that I think would make decent pickups this week, Sam Bradford versus Detroit. Dak Prescott, how about that guy? Solid option there versus Cleveland if he's still available in your leagues as well. How about the tight end position? I only see 3 names here. Thank goodness I don't have to talk about one. I kid. Kev, 3rd week in a row, buddy.
I know. Maybe one day it'll hit. Just keep going to the same well, and one day maybe you pull out something. I mean, Cameron Brate, going up against the Falcons. The Falcons allow the 6th most points to the tight end position. I don't know. I mean, let's hope for this week. I mean, there's a ton of guys on bye that we continue to say that, and I'm getting a little tired of saying it, but it's the truth. With so many guys on bye, the tight end position is so volatile. Really, if he scores a touchdown, you feel pretty good about it. So, and what should be a good matchup, probably high scoring, I think Cameron Brate could find the end zone this week.
All right, Cameron Brate, forever a streaming option. He just has some great matchups this year, man. Atlanta, another great matchup for him. Maybe one day he'll put it all together. Jen, we're going to jump over to you. You have one of my favorites here going against the Carolina Panthers.
Nice. I have one of your favorites. I've got Lance Kendricks from the Rams this week. Great streaming option, not owned in a lot of leagues, 2% owned in Yahoo League, so he's definitely out there. He's had 17 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's had a touchdown and 89 yards. And he's facing Carolina, who give up the 2nd most fantasy points for tight ends. And they've given up 7 touchdowns to tight ends so far this season. So if you're looking for somebody to plug and play, I mean, this is a guy that this is a team that gave up 3 touchdowns to Fleener and Hill together when they face New Orleans. So Kendricks could be huge this week. And definitely if you're picking somebody up because you've got buys, he's a great candidate for sure.
Love me some Lance Kendricks. The only consistent weapon on that Rams offense the past couple of weeks too. So a great matchup there against Carolina. Ben, it looks like you have another guy that I am starting on my SFB lineup this week. It's an injury. It's injury riddled. Don't ask. You got the rookie down there in Atlanta.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the Thursday night game, and I don't usually love Thursday night games, but I too think this could be a high-scoring one. Jacob Tamme is out for the game, and Austin Hooper has looked pretty good in limited action. He had 5 catches for 41 yards this past week. I think a lot of that after Jacob Tamme went out with the injury. Shout out to Scott Barrett, at Scott Barrett DFB on Twitter. He tweeted, I think it was earlier today, that Hooper has 195 yards on 12 targets, whereas Tamme has 210 yards on 30 targets. So Tamme, we all kind of know, is on his last leg. This could be an addition by subtraction thing. Hooper has more upside. He gets to play with the quarterback one so far this season in Matt Ryan, and gets a Bucs defense giving up the 10th most passing yards per game, and that is tied for the 9th most passing touchdowns given up. So I like Hooper this week. And this could be a little bit of my DFS thought process, but with Tamme being out, I think that makes Hooper very relevant, and he should be readily available on the waiver wire. Should definitely be available in your league unless somebody's already picked him up this week.
Yeah, only 1% owned in Yahoo leagues. He has 11 catches, 200 yards, and a touchdown on the year. Great option there, Austin Hooper. We don't see rookie tight ends do much very often, but this year – we've had Hunter Henry, and now Austin Hooper could be another big play. All right, guys, we're going to get into the defense and special teams units. Do you guys mind if I read them off? If you have something to say about them, go ahead and shoot. Last week we mentioned DST, and I think Frank had a heart attack. So the options we have for you this week from a defense and special teams perspective, we have the Packers versus the Colts, Cowboys versus the Browns, Falcons at Tampa, that Thursday night matchup showing up again, Giants versus the Eagles, that's a bit surprising to me, Dolphins versus the Jets, and Bills at Seattle. Ben, Bills at Seattle, wow.
Yeah, a little crazy, but And it feels weird to bet against Russell Wilson, but I don't really like to stream defenses that I don't think are very good. And I do think the Bills are a pretty good defense. They're actually tied with the Broncos for the most sacks in the NFL. And you just look at Russell Wilson. He is banged up right now. He can't run, which is one of the best parts of his game. He's got the knee issue, and now there's a reported pec injury that he's dealing with as well. So really all he can do is throw from the pocket, but he has not thrown a touchdown pass in his last 3 games. So I think this could be a situation where the Seahawks offense struggles again. The Bills can get after him, get some sacks, potentially get a turnover or 2. They're pretty high owned, but I think it's in the 60s, 60% range. So if they're available, it's definitely a defense you can look at. And again, they've actually been a pretty good defense this season.
All right, can't argue with you there. Russell has been bad. Any other comments on the DSTs from Jen or Kev?
Cowboys are against Cleveland. That is all.
That's all she needs. That's all she needs. Cowboys are against Cleveland. All right, let's get into the best of the rest. These are players that are owned in less than 20% of ESPN or Yahoo leagues, and there's a possibility they'll make it past waivers unclaimed. Let's get into it. Jen, we will start with you this time. Another tight end option.
Okay, sorry. Had an unmute issue. Fedorowicz, CJ Fedorowicz is who I'm going with. I know he's on bye this week, but I couldn't let this opportunity go by because there's some other guys that we've already talked about that are still up there and still on the waivers. But this is a guy that I've really saw that he just isn't owned and has been utilized a lot as for an tight end position. So weeks 4 through 8, he's been the number 2 fantasy tight end. The past 3 weeks, he's at 21 targets, 2 touchdowns, 163 yards. And if you're looking forward at his schedule, like he's got Jacksonville next, so they aren't the most liberal with their points against tight ends. So I'll give you that. But after that, he's got Oakland, which is a great matchup. San Diego, not too bad. And then you look forward at the playoffs, and you've got Indianapolis, Jacksonville again. So that's, week 15, so you got to keep that in mind. And then Cincinnati again. So this is a guy when you're looking at tight ends and people that are getting targets and getting you some usage when overall this is a pretty inconsistent position. He's somebody that's really coming on and heating up. So I would snag him now. He's on bye weeks. People might let him pass by and let him sit on the waivers. You might even be able to get him post-waiver wire like we're talking about. Very rarely owned. Wait, let me see. What's his percentage? 12%? 14% in Yahoo leagues and even lower in ESPN leagues. So this is a guy that's available, and you might be able to snag him now bye week. People aren't paying attention and really get a steal. Did I render everybody speechless with my argument?
No, I was talking into the mute. I apologize.
It was too good, Jen. It was too good.
Too good to be true. Thought I rendered
Mic drop.
Mic drop.
Mic drop. That is a great schedule, though, by the way. And he seems to be the most consistent receiver on that team. Seems to be a growing trend for the tight end position this year. They're going from absolute garbage to, the only relevant receiver on a given team. And while that Jacksonville matchup is pretty tough, Jen, keep in mind they let up 100-plus yards to the tight end this past weekend versus Tennessee, so they are beatable against the tight end position. Great matchup there. Great call out there. I can speak English today, guys, I promise. Ben, you have one of my favorite pickups for this week. Likely just going to be a monster ad for the week on Yahoo. I'm sure he's been added 20,000 times already because a lot of Yahoo leagues don't have waivers for some reason. Once you get into this newly touted starter for the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, so another guy going into a bye week, but I think definitely worth the pickup regardless, is J.J. Nelson. When I looked earlier today, he was only owned in 3% of Yahoo leagues and 1.2% of ESPN leagues. But like you said, that is going to go way up. He saw 12 targets this past week, a 26.7% target share, and he caught 8 passes for 79 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's seen 19 targets in his last 2 weeks. And like you said, head coach Bruce Arians confirmed on Monday that he's now a starting wide receiver, most likely supplanting Michael Floyd, who has been very up and down this season. just has not looked good at times. And John Brown dealt with the concussion to begin the year, got off to a slow start, and now has I think he missed 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, for leg pains from the sickle cell trait. Played this past week, but I think it was only over 50% of snaps. So he's been dealing with a lot. Now you got Larry Fitzgerald dealing with an ankle. J.J. Nelson is a big play threat. He's a guy I really like a lot. He ran a 4.28 40 last year at the Combine and plays a completely different role than Larry Fitzgerald. So Fitzgerald is still going to continue to be the one when healthy, but J.J. Nelson can still be relevant, especially when you consider that Larry Fitzgerald, John Brown, and Michael Floyd were all relevant when they were healthy last season. Now, Carson Palmer has not been the same quarterback, which is a concern, but I still think J.J. Nelson is a guy that's going to be in consideration every single week moving forward, as long as he continues to be ahead of Michael Floyd, which remains to be seen. That might fluctuate a little bit, but for right now, the information that we have, that is the case. And you look at their schedule when they come back from the bye, they have games against the 49ers, Falcons, Redskins, Dolphins, Saints. So their schedule looks pretty nice going forward as well. And Nelson is definitely a guy I would pick up. Honorable mention to CJ Prosise. I thought about talking about him, but then realized Nelson was the better play. But Prosise is now healthy and is starting to get more work, and is probably the main reason why the Seahawks cut CJ Spiller. So you can look at him as well if he's available and you're in need of a running back.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed out their schedule, Arizona's schedule, because the two that you mentioned at the end there, Miami and New Orleans, were fantasy playoff. So those are two amazing teams to have a wide receiver against. And so if you're looking forward, which you should be at this point, and when you're rostering guys, this should be something that you're taking into account. And J.J. Nelson has a amazing Week 14, Week 15 lineup ahead of him.
Listen, I hope my Dolphins absolutely ruin all of your fantasy. I hope they destroy J.J. Nelson. But God, we don't have any corners, so we got to work on that. Hopefully, we're
chances
finally.
That are slim chances, folks. Don't worry.
Hopefully, we're finally getting some clarity in that Arizona wide receiver core. By the way, it's been a very frustrating year so far trying to decide which Arizona receiver is going to do something this week. Hopefully, J.J. Nelson will be that name going forward. Kev, it looks like you have another tight end going here. We have a trend, right? I mean, I don't know how many it takes to form a trend, but this is probably the fifth tight end or sixth tight end that we're talking about at this point. So I feel comfortable saying it's a trend.
It is. And I will say this, the J.J. Nelson call, I love me some J.J. Nelson. I actually fired him up in plenty of DFS lineups last week, and that worked out very well on DraftKings, as I think he scored 27 fantasy points on DraftKings. So I've been on the J.J. Nelson train there. As for the player I have, that would be Ladarius Green. He is cleared to practice this week. He looks like he could return this week. And as we know, as we kind of talked about him into the offseason, his ceiling is rather high. However, can he stay healthy is another question. But there in Pittsburgh, I mean, yes, Jesse James has been there. He's been solid as a real life NFL player, but as fantasy, no, not really. More just kind of a hoping to get a touchdown guy. But Ladarius Green brings another level to that offense that obviously Jesse James can't provide. So, for me, I think he's at the very worst the number 3 option there in the offense, but could easily be the number 2 option behind obviously Antonio Brown with Big Ben back now. So I love Ladarius Green. I have some hoping to pick him up this week. Actually going to drop Jack Doyle for him quite a few places. But I love Ladarius Green. I think his ceiling is about as high as you can get, especially for any tight end that's going to be available on the waiver wire.
Good call out there. Like me a lot of Ladarius Green too. We're still waiting for Ladarius Green to become something, right? But his ceiling, you can just see it. I mean, he showed enough in San Diego where you're like, I know he can do it. We're just waiting for him to do it. So hopefully he will be a key part of that Pittsburgh offense. Jesse James did a good job filling in, so hopefully Green can just kind of take over. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on mine, guys, but I do want to mention Tim Hightower of the New Orleans Saints. Sean Payton came out and said that he deserves more playing time, will get more playing time. Maybe this is on the heels of Mark Ingram scoring negative fantasy points this past weekend. I don't know. What a disaster, Ingram. Did he get?
Well, he got benched. No, he got benched. He fumbled and got benched.
He got benched. It's even worse. Couldn't put him back in, at least get my points back for me. Come on, Peyton. Jeez. All right, guys, it's time for the mid-season report. We are going to take a look at the overview of the fantasy universe as it stands right now. We are heading into week 9. It is the halfway point. Just a few short weeks. If your fantasy's playoffs start in week 14, you only got 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 5 more games to go. I can count. And
trusty, counting on your fingers.
There we go.
I feel like we need a sound effect, like the mid-season roundup, like I don't know. We need like some sound effect,
like some drops.
Yeah, like something like ooh.
It's going to be Jennifer saying that right there. That's what's going to be the soundbite for the mid-season report.
Ooh.
The first thing we're going to talk about, guys, is the biggest surprises, because who doesn't like to talk about surprises? Ben, why don't we start with you, since you seem to have a monopoly on the list of surprise players this year?
Yeah, I'll talk about a few guys here, but the main surprise for me is Isaiah Crowell. And I generally avoid running backs that are on bad teams. And I did not want any part of Crowell this year, and that has turned out to be a mistake. The Browns are 0-8, okay? They have not won a single game, and Crowell is still the RB10. He's 12th in the NFL in rushing yards. He has 121 more rushing yards than Todd Gurley on 28 less attempts this year, which just blows my mind. And he's done it all while sharing time with Duke Johnson in somewhat close to a 50-50 split in a lot of games. So that has totally surprised me. Sticking with the Browns, Terrelle Pryor surprised me too. I thought this guy was going to be an interesting, occasional deep threat. I did not expect him to turn into a legit wide receiver, and that's exactly what he's done. He is huge. He's a stud. He's tied for the 7th most targets in the league, and he is clearly taking advantage of that. We talked about Corey Coleman coming back, but Pryor is going to continue to be relevant. And one more I'll throw in there is Mike Wallace, because I thought this dude was washed, and he has been pretty darn good this year, especially with Steve Smith out of the lineup. I'm not sure if Steve Smith is looking like he's going to play this week or not, but Mike Wallace has been solid. You can continue to count on him, especially when Smith is out. He's a wide receiver too right now, and he can catch some deep balls from Joe Flacco. So those are 3 guys that easily came to mind as guys that I did not expect to do that much coming into the year, and they have greatly outperformed my expectations.
Hey Ben, can you do the Mike Wallace part again? You went full-blown robot on us there for a second.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Just tell me when.
Start. Where the heck? Where was he with the Mike Wallace thing? I think you were just after you said you didn't expect him, and he's been doing solid with Steve Smith gone. It was right after the Steve Smith part, you kind of went robot on us.
Okay, wait. Let me try to figure out where I'm picking up. Then.
Pretty much to start Mike Wallace over again.
Okay, gotcha. And Mike Wallace has also surprised me. I thought this dude was washed, and he's been solid this year. He's been a wide receiver too. He's been very good, especially with Steve Smith out of the lineup. So I'm not sure what Steve Smith's prognosis is for this week if he's going to play. But if he's out again, this is a guy you can continue to count on. He's been catching deep balls from Joe Flacco. So Crowell, Pryor, and Wallace are 3 guys that instantly came to mind as players that I did not expect to do much this year, and they've greatly outperformed my expectations.
I 150% agree. I even put a joking little note in here that you had stolen all of my guys that I would have chosen as the biggest surprise. I got to say, I did like Mike Wallace before the season, but I had no idea he was going to perform as well as he has been. That's for sure. Jen, let's go with you. I love your 2 that you have on here as well, especially the ageless wonder there in Indianapolis. There was a lot of arguments this offseason about whether or not Mr. Frank Gore would do anything this season. He's looked good so far. What do you got to say about him?
Heck yeah. I don't know if everybody remembers, and I guess I'm kind of playing a little bit off in the way of he didn't surprise me because he was one of my undervalued players going into the year, including Matt Ryan. And so he's kind of like one of my champions, or I'm like, oh, you're coming out fighting for me. He's making me proud, because I think one of the biggest things with Frank Gore last year is that he ended up, decently high at the end of the year, but that all the owners were really disappointed because he just wasn't consistent for them. That they would play him, they would put him in their starting roster, and then he wouldn't perform. And I think this year that's really turned around. They're giving him the touches. We were afraid about the offensive line, and I can't say it's been amazing, but out of the 8 weeks that have happened, they have not gone on their bye yet. 6 out of 8, he scored double-digit fantasy points. Touchdowns, I wish there was a little bit more there, but right now he's the number 11 fantasy running back, and he was drafted right around the number 26 running back and number 73rd overall. So he was in the 6th round. So he was one of these guys we were looking at. If you're going 0 RB and you were going really wide receiver heavy in your draft for the first few or multiple rounds, Frank Gore was somebody that you were drafting, most likely, or at least looking at drafting. And I think a lot of people passed on him, and he's actually doing really decent. So Frank Gore is somebody that I really liked and wanted to mention. And then Jamison Crowder for the Redskins. He was pretty much undrafted, unless you're listening to Jeff here. I mean, I don't know if that was preseason, Kev. Maybe you can remind me. But Crowder was somebody that Jeff really liked. And I think we all thought that he had potential, but we were hoping, Deshaun Jackson would bounce back and be a bigger offensive weapon than I think anybody than we saw last year, clearly with the injuries and things like that. And Crowder has really stepped up. So to go from undrafted to the number 16 wide receiver, he gets on average about 7 targets per game and around, 62 yards per game at throwing a touchdown there and, here and there for an undrafted guy. I mean, he's a wide receiver too. So I don't know what more you could ask of somebody that you were getting as, I would say he qualifies as like one of my value picks. He's a surprise, but also somebody that you got for cheap or nothing, and he's performing for you right now when the wide receiver, position right now is really touch and go, and some of these guys that you spent really a lot of draft capital on aren't capitalizing for you, and Crowder is. So those are my 2 guys. So I'm surprised and proud of them.
There you go, Crowder. I liked me some Crowder too. Wasn't sure if he was going to be able to get anything going there with Pierre Garçon coming back, Deshaun Jackson coming back from a pretty solid year as well, and Jordan Reed being back healthy, but Jordan Reed didn't last very long being healthy, did he? So, Kev, loving your surprise pick of the year. I couldn't agree more. It was a guy I was really, really down on this offseason. Even made a joke that, the Atlanta Falcons weren't going to be very good this year. Well, joke's on me, I guess. You like some Matt Ryan as the biggest surprise of the year.
Yeah, I mean, so he went. So in drafts, he went 20th, so basically almost undrafted. In most leagues, I know he was, widely available to start the season, and he's kind of give the old middle finger FU to everybody. He's right now the QB1, and it's really not particularly close for what so far through. So he leads the league in passing and passing touchdowns through 8 weeks, and like I said, I mean he's been an absolute monster so far. Even in weeks where we sort of thought, like, okay, you're not going to play him this week, when he went to Denver or whenever he played against Seattle in Seattle, I mean, he produced. And he continues to shine. He only has 4 interceptions on the season. And, I mean, like I said, he was a guy that most people were able to pick up off the waiver wire so far. So I love Matt Ryan. I really liked him over the offseason, and I know Jen did too, as a guy who really bounced back. Especially for all the people and advising people who draft quarterback late, like he was a great target. I think between him and Matthew Stafford, you could really make an argument that either one of them could be, even in like real football, be the MVP of the league right now for both of them. Because like Atlanta, they haven't really changed. They didn't really change all that much from last year. Yes, Mohamed Sanu, I guess, is better obviously than what Roddy White was, but I think I could go out there and run better routes than Roddy White at this point of his career. So I don't know, but other than that, they haven't really done anything. So they still have Jacob Tamme, and I've just been very impressed with the turnaround of the entire offense there. Obviously, the running game with Tevin Coleman and Devonta Freeman have been elite as well. So, like I said, I didn't see this level of production coming. I thought he could be a low-end QB1. Certainly didn't feel like through 8 weeks of the season he was going to be the QB1.
Yep, I completely agree with you there. Absolutely, 100%. I got him off waivers, by the way, so he was undrafted in quite a few leagues.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty happy about that. I'm feeling pretty good about that waiver pickup right about now. Well worth it. Budget. Well worth it.
Mm-hmm.
The guy I wanted to talk about was actually a guy that we talked a lot about in the offseason as a guy who might fall back down to earth, and that's Michael Crabtree. I think expectations here with most of TFA was a guy who experienced great success his first year with Oakland, but this year may kind of come back down to more of an average fantasy player, may not have the production he had last year. But guess what? Halfway through the season, he's on pace to break every single stat he had last year. He's on pace for more receptions, more yards, and more touchdowns, and he's averaging 15 more yards a game than he was last year. Michael Crabtree's been super impressive, especially being alongside Amari Cooper. I think that probably helps him more than anything. But don't forget, this guy was a first-round pick himself, so it's not like he didn't have the talent. He just needed the team to fit, and he fits very well with the Raiders. Seems like I'm a Raiders fanboy today, but I think Crabtree and the Raiders has been a surprise to me. And I actually have to mention, this will be more of a conversation here because Melvin Gordon is on here. As Kev put a note, somebody mentioned Melvin Gordon. Absolutely, that he was ADP in the 6th round. He's the number 3 overall fantasy running back. As my cousin texted me when I was facing him, and I have Melvin Gordon, he's like, all Melvin Gordon does is score touchdowns.
I actually added that note.
Did you? I'm sorry, Jen.
It was too much of a value play. I think what we were looking at is surprise and like what we kind of think of for surprise. And I know Melvin Gordon for us, when we were talking in the off season, we were having these podcasts, Melvin Gordon was not somebody that were surprised about his success, but I think a lot of people, given where he was drafting and the value that you got him at, he should be surprising you right now as the number 3 running back in fantasy right now, and he was drafted in like the 6th round again. If you're going 0 RB in those first rounds, you're going wide receiver heavy. Melvin Gordon was somebody that you have to be really excited about if you snagged him in the 5th, 6th round, and he is producing RB1 level ahead of a ton of guys that a lot of your comrades were probably drafting in the 1st round. So just thought that we had to mention him as somebody that has just been a spectacular value fantasy-wise this year.
I love that call, and I'm going to be talking about him here in a few minutes as well.
Awesome. So we'll get some more Melvin Gordon talk for you.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
To steal your thunder.
No, you're fine. I did it to you earlier.
Yeah, look, he stole yours, you stole his. His thunder being stolen all around. So let's get into actually the biggest bust here. So for biggest surprise, we all chose a positive surprise. Nobody chose a negative surprise. So let's get rid of all this positivity. We need some negatives, damn it. So let's get into the biggest bust. Lots of names here. Nobody has their name next to it. So this should be a bit of a surprise even for me as to who you're going to pick. Kev, why don't you get the ball rolling with your biggest bust of the year?
I mean, I think there's a lot of names that you could go off of, but I think it has to be Russell. One of the guys that is definitely in the discussion is Russell Wilson right now. He's QB 24. As we sort of already have talked about him, the injuries has just sapped what makes Russell Wilson so great is his ability to get out of the pocket because, as we know, the Seattle Seahawks do not possess an elite-level offensive line. They may have one of the worst offensive lines in the league, and if he cannot get outside of the pocket and kind of do the Russell Wilson, extending plays or, his rushing ability, we kind of see what he is. I mean, he's really, he's been awful this year. And to be honest, it's what's even more crazy to me is so far on the season, he has 44 rushing yards on the year. Tom Brady has the same amount in 4 weeks. That is a stat you'd never thought you would say, that Tom Brady and Russell Wilson both have the same amount of rushing yards. But that's our reality right now with Russell Wilson. At this point, I hate to say it, but he's not worth starting in any format. Last week was sort of the get-right game for him, going to the Coors Field of the NFL and playing, in the Superdome against the Saints, and he was awful. Didn't do anything. And to be honest, I, as a C-Mike owner, somebody who had drafted Kristen Michael, was just as pissed off there in that entire game because, I felt like that was going to be a game that he was really going to blow up. However, he only got 10 carries. Luckily, he did find the end zone, which made him a decent play. But as of right now, I think Russell Wilson is unstartable until further notice, until he really proves that he's kind of over that hump. I've actually, as you know, Jeff is actually from Washington, from Seattle, diehard Seahawks fan, and we've been talking about it lately. And I asked him like 3 or 4 weeks ago, why don't the Seahawks just bench or sit Russell Wilson to allow him to get right? They have a decent lead in the division. Like, you're not worried about anybody there. The Rams, the 49ers, none of those teams are going to come up and get you, and the Cardinals continue to fail. So why not bench him? Yes, you may take a couple losses because of it, but if you can get him healthy, the Seahawks have the chance to go to a Super Bowl, but they do not have that chance with Russell Wilson and his current state. So for me, like I said, as for fantasy, I'm not playing him until he absolutely proves that he is back to the Russell Wilson of old.
I completely agree.
Yeah, well said. Not much to add to that.
Yeah, I'm a big Russell Wilson fan, and it pains me to hear that because it's so true. And we were talking before we started. I drafted Russell Wilson in the first round of the Scott Fish Bowl, and that's the only league where I own him, and I'm kind of forced to start him. But if it was a one quarterback league where I could find another option, I would be doing it, just like you said, because it is not good right now.
Absolutely. So, Jen, oh boy. I'm looking at your biggest bust here.
Why, oh boy? What?
All right, we'll see what this turns into. Who's your biggest bust of the year so far?
Okay, I'm wondering if I don't know how somebody would argue this with me, but Doug Martin is my biggest bust of the year. He played a game and a half, and I think what's the hardest thing is to see Charles Sims come in and us think that's going to happen, and then us to see Jacquizz Rodgers come in and then give somebody 19 or 30, 26, 19 carries, and know that if Martin was in there, he'll be killing it. This is a guy that people were drafting in the second round. He was the 8th to 11th, right around there, running back off the board. And this is a guy that has not produced for you since game 1, arguably, but game 2. And he's sitting with hamstring injuries, and we actually don't even know when and if he will be back. So here we are now, we talk about Anton Smith coming in and them kind of having probably a running back up by committee since everybody is injured. But it's just hard to see a team like the Bucs. I actually feel bad for them when they had so much talent and they really want to run the ball, and that would have really helped them. And just to see guys like Doug Martin just fall off, and we don't really know what's going to happen. So for me, that's a huge bust because he just hasn't given any production to his owners who gave high draft capital. Not just that, though, that they're probably keeping him on their bench because what do? Drop Doug Martin, not really knowing when he's going to come back, and then he's taking up a roster spot. So you're in this horrible position of, do I drop this guy and cut him? Here we are halfway through the season, yet he's Doug Martin. If he comes back, he's going to eat it up. So it's basically, in my opinion, the worst case scenario for a fantasy player. If you get the draft capital, then they're stuck and they're taking up a bench spot for you, and you can't pick up somebody off the waivers to adequately, kind of plug them in. So Doug Martin, by far, for me, is the biggest bust.
Oh, I know that pain. As somebody who has Doug Martin in 2 of my 5 leagues, I have been just holding on to him tightly, hoping he'll come back. Sometimes I'll just sit there, rock back and forth, and hope.
This is fine.
You guys can't see it, but he actually did the rock back and forth, the comforting, self-soothing rock.
So I said, uh-oh, Jen, because I really thought you were going to go with Jeremy Maclin there. You went with Martin. I agree. Definitely a bigger bust in this mid-season report here.
I would lean into Maclin, but Doug Martin's bigger for me.
So, Ben, who do you got down as your biggest bust so far this year?
So when I think of a big bust, I'm thinking of high draft picks. So I'm going to go with DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins right now is tied for 7th in the NFL in targets. So he's still seeing volume, but he's 16th in catches and 34th in yards in the NFL. And if you look at Hopkins' numbers compared to Will Fuller's, where Hopkins was a first-round pick and Fuller was a late-round pick if he was drafted at all in most leagues. Hopkins has 40 catches for 434 yards and 3 touchdowns on the year. Fuller has 25 catches for 372 yards and 2 touchdowns on the year. So there's not a huge gap there between a guy, again, you had to take in the first round versus a guy you might have not even had to draft. So that leads me to think he's definitely a bust. And the thing is, I thought DeAndre Hopkins was quarterback proof, and we saw that last year, right? He got it done with multiple quarterbacks, 3, if it wasn't 4 last year. And that was one of the reasons why I even talked up Brock Osweiler for 2 quarterbacks a little bit in the offseason, and that obviously turned out to be a terrible idea. I even got roped into – I didn't play Brock Osweiler in DFS last week, but I did write about him as like a punt play with that matchup against the Lions, and he couldn't even take advantage of that. So you have the report coming out now from Schefter, I think, where Osweiler's lost confidence. He's not getting it done. I think a big reason why CJ Fedorowicz has been so relevant right now is because Osweiler is just scared to throw the ball to the outside and down the field. And so Hopkins has just not lived up to the first-round pick expectations. And I don't think, looking at the outlook, if you own Hopkins, you feel very good about it going forward because he's still tied to Brock Osweiler, who has just been downright awful this year.
Yeah, it's funny. We actually did before the season started, we kind of did like a little burning questions sort of article with the whole team. And we did we thought was going to be the prime to be a bust this year. And that's actually who I picked was DeAndre Hopkins. I didn't feel great about him. I felt like with the other options that were there, I thought that was actually going to hinder him and he wasn't going to receive the 3rd most targets that he saw last year in the league at 187. So that was one thing that really I wasn't really impressed with. And I also felt like with Lamar Miller involved in the offense, that was actually another that they were going to lose the volume they had because last season they were near the top of the league in terms of pass attempts. And that was mainly because they were running out Alfred Blue every week as their starting running back. So he was a guy that I was a little nervous about. But you're right. I mean, Brock Osweiler has been absolutely horrendous so far this year. I'm pretty sure they would take Brian Hoyer back in a heartbeat.
Yeah, they should. And I definitely thought Hopkins was going to see some regression, so that's a great call by you. But I think I maybe got a little too caught up in going wide receiver heavy early on. I was taking other wide receivers over Hopkins, but Hopkins was still a guy that I thought was a first-round pick, maybe more of a late first-round pick. But even then, what he's done this year has not lived up to that. But, yeah, that's a great call by you, and it makes total sense. And when you throw Osweiler into the equation, it has not looked good.
I like that term, quarterback proof. Clearly not quarterback proof, but you would think. I mean, he's one of these receivers. You just got to get it in the vicinity, and he'll catch it. Apparently, Osweiler can't even do that. So,
well, I mean, I sort of felt like though that's not like I feel like his rise had more to do with the amount of targets that he received more than the talent that he. I still think DeAndre Hopkins is a very talented wide receiver. Not by any means am I saying that he's not, but. I don't think he's an elite level talent like you would say like a Julio Jones or an Antonio Brown or a wide receiver like that. Like I think he's in a tier below them. But overall, like I said, I still think he's a terrific athlete and obviously one of the top 5 to 10 wide receivers in the league. My issue with him was simply I didn't think the volume was going to be there, and I felt like with the additions in the passing game that they were going to be better. So.
Yeah, and just to finish up real quick, I think it was the NFL.com guys on a podcast today. They brought up a really good point where Hopkins is really not a yak guy. He's not a yards after catch guy, and he dominated with that volume last year on deep targets, and that just has not panned out with Brock Osweiler. It doesn't seem like that's been Osweiler's game, and so with Hopkins not being a yak guy and with him not catching the deep balls this year like he did last year, I think that's a huge reason why we've seen him really disappoint.
All right, there you go. DeAndre Hopkins as Ben's biggest bust. We had Kevin with Russell Wilson and Jen had Doug Martin. Guys, we don't have a ton of time, so really quickly, who is one person you expect to bounce back who has been pretty disappointing so far this year? Kevin, start with you.
What was it again? Sorry. We got distracted. Bounce back? Is that what we thought? That what it
Bounce
is?
back, yeah. The guy that's been a bust, but you think they'll bounce back the rest of the year.
But do it like we're doing like a quick takes or something, because we're at an hour 10 right now.
Well, that's good because there's not a whole lot I could say to really sway people on this, but it's just a gut feeling. Maybe it's just the guy that I just love the guys this much, but that's Allen Robinson. I just continue to hope. I may be the only guy left on the Allen Robinson train, but I'm just going to continue riding it out. And if it goes off the cliff, it goes off the cliff. I'll be right there with him. But I do think that, hey, maybe the offensive coordinator getting fired. Maybe that'll turn around. Probably not. But he is – like last week, I felt like was a week where he was really going to explode. Didn't really happen. Blake Bortles actually was like we talked about actually on the Sunday show, was probably the weirdest performance you've ever seen. If you just watched it and didn't really look at the stats, you would have thought Blake Bortles was horrible. If you didn't watch the game and you just looked at the stats, you would have thought Blake Bortles balled out, and that was just not the case. The problem with so far for Allen Robinson a lot of the times has been he's getting frustrated because Blake Bortles is not able to hit him. He's throwing him way over his head, not able to get him the ball. So I do hope that they can turn it around. Allen Robinson, I've seen people drop Allen Robinson in leagues. I think that's entirely insane. I get it. He hasn't been great. He's wide receiver 37 on the season. However, he is 13th in targets. I do hope that with this long week, they're able to just figure out, hey, maybe let's go back to what had worked for us last year. That's getting the ball to Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns and stop trying to make Marquise Lee a thing. But I don't know. We'll see.
Well, Hurns came back last week, so you got half of that equation right. I mean, it's not completely outside the realm of thinking that they could get it back together. Hurns was the only one that showed up last week, so.
Yeah, I like that call. Hope you're right. I love Allen Robinson. He was a stud for me last year. Have him in leagues this year, and it hasn't been great. We could have talked about him as biggest bust, but I do think that there is more hope for Robinson to turn it around than there is for Hopkins. So I like that. And yeah, I think there's definitely a little bit of overreaction there with dropping him. I talked about on a different podcast last week that you could look at trading him, but you don't have to do that. I'm probably just going to ride it out with him. It was hard to pick a bounce back. I'm going to go with Todd Gurley. He's only 26 in rush yards per game, and he only has 3 touchdowns on the year. So it hasn't been great. I mean, we could have talked about him as a bust too. But his lowest running back touch share of the season in LA's backfield was 82%. So we know this is the guy for the Rams. One of the problems has been he hasn't received the targets, right? Well, it looks like that's starting to change. Gurley has seen 21 targets over his past 4 games and has 4 straight games with at least 3 catches and 35 receiving yards. So if he can continue to add a little bit in the receiving game, his rushing yards should be there just based off sheer volume. He should continue to score some more touchdowns. He might have some positive regression coming there. And the Rams have games against the Dolphins, Saints, and 49ers coming up, so the schedule isn't all bad either. And we know that at any given time, Gurley's talent can transcend a bad matchup as well. So I think that he could be a guy that can bounce back and maybe a trade target. So that's who I'll go with.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. I didn't write down a bounce back here because I agree with the Todd Gurley pick. He's a guy that I like, and if somebody was trying to unload him, I would be happy to go ahead and make that purchase. Jen, you're last up on the docket. Who is your bounce back?
Yeah, I'll actually do the quick take. So, really quick. My pick is Dez Bryant. I mean, he's going to be a red zone threat no matter what. It doesn't matter if who's under center. I think he's going to come back. I mean, he got 14 targets last week versus Philly. I know he said the knee issue, so that's the big risk you're going to take. Is he going to stay healthy? Is that knee going to, keep him in the game? And that's something we can't predict. But as far as somebody that has the potential to bounce back from their earlier, season production, it's got to be Dez Bryant for me.
All right, Dez Bryant. What a talent he is too, right? Hopefully he can stay healthy because I love watching that guy play.
Yes, totally agree.
Yeah, man. Hopefully, and Dak gets him the ball. Look at the preseason, and even this past week. Yeah, completely agree. I agree with all 3. I'm not a huge Allen Robinson fan, but I do think he's got to bounce back here. I think Blake Bortles has to get it together, Blake. All right, guys, one last thing before we go ahead and close out the show. We need a fantasy MVP for the first 8 weeks of the season. They let you do Pro Bowl voting now, and they even have their MVP voting for the NFL right now. So why can't we put in some early bids for fantasy MVP? Jen, we'll start with you. Who is your fantasy MVP?
DeMarco Murray. I love this guy. I mean, he's number 3 fantasy running back right now. He came off in, about the 4th round? Everybody was saying we weren't sure if Derrick Henry, what share he was going to get. And they brought DeMarco Murray in and, his woes in Philly and, his success in Dallas, what's going to happen. And he's just dominated. And so everybody knows his production. I don't think I need to go into all of his stats. He, for me, is somebody that you got at a pretty good value and is now paying off dividends for you, just like he did, a few years prior in Dallas. I know he won it for me that year when I had him, and so I'm thinking he's winning it for people this year. And so you love having him on your roster. He's been just legit. So him, for me, is somebody that really should be considered for the MVP at this point.
Absolutely. Got me. I was a big DeMarco Murray fan, if you remember, before the season. I think it was probably just me and you, Jen, as far as the TFA crew went.
Yeah, we loved him. I mean, it's probably because of that, because he won it for me before, and I saw his talent and thought, what could he do? Didn't think he was utilized well in Philly. So it's good to see him succeed.
Yeah, his situation in Philly was awful. Glad to see him bounce back here with Tennessee. Hopefully he keeps it up. Derrick Henry looking good, though, so we'll see what happens. Kev, how about you? Who are you voting for MVP?
David fucking Johnson.
You always got to make life difficult in the editing process, don't you?
He has to. He has to let it out.
It's just
we don't want him repressed, but at the same time,
we do want him repressed. Exactly what
Veterans Day is coming up next weekend. That's just what I want for Veterans Day. So it's just to be able to sleep it in there. Yeah.
Let it out, man. Let it out.
I'll just, you know what? I really do like the idea of instead of using a beep for cursors, we use Jeremy Hill. It'll in conversations when he goes David Jeremy Hill Johnson.
I like that.
I think we have to implement it. Look for that coming to the TFA podcast real soon.
Mm-hmm.
So Kev kept it short and sweet there after asking him to keep it short and sweet previously, which he did not. But Ben, who do you like for fantasy MVP this year?
All right, let me try to keep this short and sweet this time, too. We've already talked about him a little bit, Melvin Gordon. To be clear, David Johnson was my pick, but Kevin stole him from me. So let's go with Melvin Gordon. The value was insane for Gordon this year. He leads the NFL in touchdowns with 10. He has 791 total yards. He's been the guy ever since Woodhead got hurt. He was balling out when Woodhead was still there. So he's a volume play. He's getting it done in the rushing and passing games, and he's scoring touchdowns, and that's all you can really ask for. He's getting it done in PPR and standard. He's been a stud. Loved him at Wisconsin. He's finally getting it done now, and it's been awesome to watch. So Melvin Gordon is my MVP.
There you go, Melvin Gordon. I like all 3 picks because I have shares of all 3, and they're helping these teams lead these teams to victory. So I'm loving it. DeMarco Murray, David Johnson, Melvin Gordon. So I'm going to go with a quarterback, and I'm going to go with Matt Ryan. This dude has been fantastic. I was super down on him, so this is my way of making it up to Matt Ryan. If in case he's listening to the show, you never know. Don't laugh at me. I am voting for Matt Ryan for fantasy MVP. I did want to mention, as much as I hate him, Tom Brady has to be in consideration and will likely be towards the top of this list come the end of the season. He is fastly approaching a quarterback 1, and he's only played 4 games. So unbelievable play right there for Brady. But right now, it's Matt Ryan. All right, guys. Unfortunately, what just happened? Loud noises.
I think that was my dog. Sorry.
That's okay. It scared the crap out of me. All right. Unfortunately, guys, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to the show, and thank you so much to our special guest, Ben Cummins. Ben, how can our listeners reach out to you?
You can find me on Twitter at BenCumminsFF, and you can find most of my work at 2 Quarterbacks and at the Fantasy Footballers.
All right, so head on over to @2quarterbacks and @fantasyfootballers, and make sure to check him out on Twitter @BenCummins_FF. He will be in all of our tweets that promote this show, so there is no excuse for not being able to find him. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. We really enjoyed having you on.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. I had a blast.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun. If you enjoyed the show, guys, don't forget to show us some love on Twitter @FF_authority, and check out thefantasyauthority.com. Tons of new articles every single week. All of them will get you prepared for your fantasy week. We also do a game day show every Sunday from 11:30 a.m. Eastern time right up until kickoff. So if you have questions that you have about your lineup, about waivers, about free agent options that you want to consider, maybe you just found out that a guy got hurt and you have no idea what to do, head on over to YouTube, search the Fantasy Authority, and check out a game day show. It starts at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. Of course, if you enjoyed this show, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Stitcher. We appreciate all the feedback. That'll do it for Kevin Steele, Jennifer Smith, and Ben Cummins. I'm Anthony Pinzone. This has been another episode of the Fantasy Authority Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and have an awesome night, everyone.